Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meredith Hills, and I'm the Senior Associate for Federal Policy at Advanced CTE. Welcome to the third episode of our CTE Without Limits summer video blog series. This series explores 4 of the foundational commitments that connect the principles of a new vision for career technical education that is supported by over 40 national organizations. Previous episodes explored the commitments of equity and quality. Today, we will be discussing the importance of public-private partnerships in advancing CTE without limits. Industry involvement is one of the most unique aspects of CTE, and CTE without limits, unlike past visions, specifically names action areas where industry commitment is needed. Within the vision, this foundational commitment encompasses the entire life cycle of a CTE program, from design to delivery to success and evaluation. In doing so, CTE systems and programs can be responsive to the needs of industry and the changing world of work, as well as the needs of learners. I want to take a moment to thank our partners today for joining this video blog. And at this time, I'd like to give each of our panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves and share why they support CTE Without Limits as it relates to private-public partnerships. Let's start with Vicki Coitz.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm Vicki Coitz, the Director of Federal, State, and Local Systems Change at CSW, Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. For those of you who aren't familiar with CSW, we catalyze change in education and labor market systems, policies, and practices, specifically to increase economic mobility. And that's particularly for people of color and others who have been historically excluded from success. And we support CTE Without Limits because it really helps us meet this mission. The two are almost one and the same, and we were excited to sign on to support this vision and the actions that will flow from it.
Thanks, Vicki. Jamie Francis, let's hear from you.
Yes, great to be here. Jamie Francis, Executive Director with the Center for Education and Workforce at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. We're the nonprofit affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and our particular center really focuses on trying to mobilize the business community and help them think and become active participants for the most pressing challenges experienced in education and workforce. And we signed on to CTE Without Limits for many of the reasons that Vicki mentioned, particularly that focus on equity. Employers are very eager for qualified talent to be coming to their doors and applying for many of their open jobs that exist right now, and particularly to be thinking about how employers can play a really important leadership role in better communicating what their needs are so that we can create equitable and successful pipelines of talent through CTE programs.
Thanks. And finally, we'll hear from Brianna McCain, who's also a former team member of mine at Advanced CTE. So great to see you again.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm Brianna McCain. I'm a state policy analyst at National Skills Coalition. So National Skills Coalition fights for a national commitment to inclusive, high quality skills training so that more people have access to a better life and more local businesses see sustained growth. And we signed on to CTE Without Limits because it aligns very well with National Skills Coalition commitment to an inclusive, high quality skills training, particularly given its emphasis on ensuring students and workers have access to the opportunities and supports needed to succeed in training programs.
Thank you. And thanks again to you all for being here today and for supporting this vision. Now I'd like to turn to some questions for the full group. And Brianna, I'd like to start with you on this first one, as I know equity and access is a particular passion of yours and one of National Skills Coalition's focuses in building people-centered systems across learning and work. So why do you think that public-private partnerships are becoming part of the strategy for increasing access and equity in CTE programs?
In part, I think public-private partnerships are becoming part of the strategy for increasing access and equity in CTE because of the history of CTE. So historically, a disproportionate number of low-income learners, learners of color, learners with disabilities, women, and other historically marginalized populations were tracked into terminal vocational programs. While today the quality of CTE has vastly improved, making it the preferred path for many students and workers, the involvement of business or other private entities in CTE programs can act as a way to build trust with those communities that vocational programs of the past failed to appropriately serve. Private entities can play a role in ensuring that CTE programs are responsive to today's labor market and aligned with high quality, high wage, in-demand careers. Additionally, public-private partnerships can play an integral role in ensuring that students and workers in CTE programs have access to the supportive services that they need to not only complete a program, but to thrive in those programs, which is what we want at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And Jamie, let's hear from you on that same question.
I think Brianna hit the nail on the head when it comes to that keyword of responsiveness. So kind of reorienting the role that employers play as part of this pipeline and really helping them shift their mindset to be end customers of these public-private partnerships so that we can unlock their engagement, so that we're looking for longer term solutions versus playing the kind of one-off advisory boards that have been more customary in these partnerships between public and private sectors. They're recognizing that in order for them to really get to see a positive return on investment, they need to capitalize on those partnerships and relationships, which is so critically important. So it's great to see that so many partners recognize that none of us can do this work alone. It's going to take these really effective public-private partnerships to make a difference for these students so that the experiences they're having in CTE programs are worthwhile, both for them as well as for the educators, as well as for the employers.
Mm-hmm. And Vicki, now we'll turn to you.
Sure. We know in order to work, the equity paradigm really needs to run throughout the course of a student's CTE journey. Everything from preparing them for CTE to accessing the programs, to learning in the programs, to completion, graduation, and to their next step, whether it's continuing education or employment. And in each phase, we need to assess if we're being equitable and if all the players are on board with that goal. We also know from workforce development that employers need to provide input in each of those phases. So when we bring the two together, equity in each phase and employer in each phase, we see why it's obviously becoming a strategy in CTE and workforce development, and even in post-secondary education in general. If we don't do this, we won't have effective, meaningful, or equitable programs. And public-private partnerships are a methodology for bringing all of this together.
Thanks. And I like how you phrase that as a methodology. And I think what the three of you said about this holistic partnership involved at every stage, and especially to address historical inequities, is just so important. I want to start with Vicki on this next question, because your organization's competency project really dives into what's happening in states. How can state or federal policy, or both, be leveraged to advance the goal of connecting industry, workforce, and systems of learning?
Great. I've been thinking about this question for many years in my career across different organizations. And, really, I try to boil it down into achieving federal policy or state policy change towards a particular goal is kind of like a road trip. There are key components that you need to do. You need to have a vision and a plan. You need to map it out. Make sure that you and your partners in the car have a shared vision for where you're going and what the trip is going to look like and where you're going to stop. So in policy terms, this means you got to have the policies to support what you're doing. You got to have compacts and agreements. Research and development helps to build the buy-in in those policies and those compacts and those agreements. So that vision and planning. Number two is financing. You got to have your gas money, you got to have your snack money, you got to have money for your lodging. And this is where I think too many partnerships fail, because they don't fund partnerships specifically. They fund a bunch of other stuff, the programming and, the education, and they hope that the partnerships happen. But in order to get partnership, you need to fund the partnerships. You also need to grade your funding. And we've been hearing about this for years, but like on the road trip, sometimes you'll use a credit card, sometimes you'll use cash, sometimes, you may barter for something. So you really think creatively and braid that funding together. The third step, which doesn't really sound like a step, but actually is just get started. There's so many great ideas out there that get talked about a lot around tables around the country, and they never move. They never get out of the driveway. So even if it's a small pilot, just get started, because that's the momentum that will help you and your partners keep moving forward, keep getting buy-in, keep working together. And then finally, the last step is really, look back while you're looking forward. So as you're looking forward on your road trip, look back and reflect on where you've been. Look at the photos on your phone. Think about, that great time you had in Kansas, my home state. So in terms of policy, this is about performance measurement, making sure that you're measuring your success at different milestones, and making sure that you're measuring equity all the way along that, and then using that for continuous improvement. So those aren't specific policies, but I think it's kind of a framework for thinking about what kind of components of policies you're going to need to have successful federal and state policy to support this goal.
That's a wonderful analogy. I would love to see that in a short video or infographic, just throwing it out there. Brianna, now let's hear from you.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to reiterate a lot of what Vicki said, but specifically one way to align industry, workforce, and systems of learning is to promote sector partnership policies, either through funding, technical assistance, or program initiatives, ideally through all three types of support. Through sector partnerships, employers work together with education, training, labor, and community-based organizations to develop plans to close skills gaps. We've seen states effectively braid federal and state funds to support sector partnerships. Specifically, I'm thinking of the California community colleges who braided Perkins 4 funding with funds authorized by two different pieces of state legislation to support their Doing What Matters for Jobs in the Economy initiative, which brought together colleges and employers to create alignment around and deliver on workforce training and career pathways. And that's just one example of how funding can be leveraged to promote sector partnerships to connect industry, workforce, and systems of learning.
Thanks for sharing that. And finally, Jamie.
Yeah, I think about this in two buckets. I love Vicki's analogy, so I'm going to steal that at some point, but I've always thought about policy in kind of two categories, one of which is the incentives bucket, is how can we use policy as a means for incentivizing effective partnerships that are based on those performance measures that Vicki and Brianna touched on. It's so critically important that we're not just continuing programs or policies longer serving students and workers, then they need to be updated. They need to get ahead of the times to make sure that they're really effective for their intended populations. And then which ones are creating barriers? Let's make sure that we are eliminating those that are no longer serving students well, and perhaps even stifling innovation and creative partnerships, maybe excluding some people at the table because they haven't always been at the table. That's going to be really critical as we try to improve equity and diversify our pipelines, again, in ways that not only serve the people, but also serve communities at large. So policy is tricky in that way. And we have to make sure that we are constantly keeping track of what's working and what's not working, and make sure that we can adjust as needed.
That is such an important point, and thank you for bringing that up. Jamie, I'm going to turn back to you to answer this next question first. There's a lot of discussion of how to get more employers and industry organizations involved in CTE programs. And this vision names specific steps for systems of learning and work to talk to each other to be better involved in the process earlier. So public-private partnerships are playing an increasingly larger role in implementing high quality and equitable CTE. We all see this happening. How can the process to build these partnerships and implement programs together be streamlined to easily facilitate the partnership between industry and education? So simple question.
We had a fantastic opportunity working with Advanced CTE and some of your partners across the country to think about our talent pipeline management framework, which we created because of the people without jobs, jobs without people challenges that so many communities across the country experience pre-COVID as well as post-COVID, of course. And it allowed us to take a deep dive look into the process that we've created and think about how it applies to CTE partnerships. And what TPM comes down to, like so many of the projects and initiatives that all of our organizations focus on, it comes down to communication and trying to simplify and make sure that folks understand the roles that they are meant to play. So as I mentioned, we think about employers as the end customer of these pipelines, which helps unlock that that engagement and leadership, so that they aren't playing those one-off roles, so that they do see themselves as an integral part of the process every step along the way, and to provide them with a framework and a guidebook so that they do understand, here's the role that I need to play at this stage. Here's the type of information that I need to be providing to not just my education partners, but to my potential employees as well, so that all folks are understanding what it is that's going to take to fill that job successfully, and to be able to access career advancement opportunities. So every step of the way, we all have to understand what our respective roles are, so that we can be more effective players as part of this pipeline. So what are the open jobs that are available? How many of them are there? What are the critical skills? Not so much focused on credentials, but what are those critical skills that we need in order to hire somebody for that position? Where do we traditionally get our talent from? And are they going to be able to provide the diversified workforce that so many of our companies are now looking for? And then how do we include performance measures every step of the way, so that we do ensure that these partnerships are really effective? So that takes consistent communication for these public-private partnerships to be effective, and to ultimately help employers understand and be such an active part of the process.
And Vicki, let's hear from you on that same question.
Absolutely. I would completely agree with Jamie on the communication. Also, what she said about each other, knowing each other's roles. And so knowing your role and then knowing everybody else's roles too. So having that shared vision of that. But I would say that it's never going to be easy or quick to develop these partnerships. They're not transactional, and they really require trust and knowing each other and each other's context, and all that just takes time and communication and being in the rooms together. And it takes that true shared vision and commitment. And I would say, as I've been thinking about it, there's an additional two things that I think are really important. One is the structure. So making sure that your structure supports partnership building. And that's the policies that we talked about a minute ago. But it's also making sure that partnership is sort of the default. So funding partnerships, having that regular meeting structure, just having those structures in place so that way partnership is the way of doing business rather than trying to swim against the tide. So really think about, are my structures supporting partnership? And then the second one is really people. We're people, we're in a people business, and all the innovation and partnership is driven by specific people. I think over my career, all the amazing partnerships I've seen, and it's usually because there's one or a few people who are really driving that. So the trick is to ride the wave. When you've got some champions and you've got some leaders and you've got some great people, ride it as far as you can and as long as you can, but also plan for turnover, because we know that there's turnover in these partnerships and these agencies. People go on to new jobs, people retire, whatever. So you always need to make sure that when you have new people joining the team, how do you get their buy-in into the vision? How do you get them into the group? How do you, get them on board with everything? And always make sure that you have a few champions. You're always developing those champions of the vision. So that way, when one champion leaves, you've got, 2 or 3 backup champions.
That's important advice, and thank you for sharing that. We're almost out of time. I have one last question, and I want to go to you, Brianna, on this one. We know that there's a positive return on investment for industry when engaged with CTE programs. What is the best way to get this message across in order to engage new industry partners?
Yeah, to engage new industry partners, I think we should uplift data that illustrates the return on investment for industry. We know that CTE programs result in a more skilled workforce that meets the needs of employers, particularly when employers are involved in the development of CTE programs. Whenever possible, we should uplift the outcomes of CTE programs and engage in a conversation about how those outcomes benefit industry. I'm thinking specifically of efforts like the Arkansas Career Pathway Initiative, which provides training opportunities developed in consultation with local employers and workforce development boards to students enrolled in the state's community and technical colleges. More than half of all career pathway initiatives enrollees obtained at least one post-secondary credential or degree compared to just 24% of non-career pathway initiative participants. Data like that paints a compelling story as to why industry should engage with CTE programs to produce a more skilled workforce. In addition to uplifting data, we should also elevate the stories of employers and workers who have benefited from engaging with CTE programs to make the case for public-private partnerships.
Wonderful. And Jamie, do you have a take on that as well?
I think that data piece is so key. And what I would emphasize is making sure that, as similarly to the previous question, that both sides are on the same page about what is being measured and to validate that those are meaningful measurements to both parties. So as long as employers have verified that, yes, these are outcomes that are important to me and things that equal success for me, then they're more likely to continue that engagement. So that's what's really critical. I think that some states have done phenomenal jobs of making, various scorecards public and accessible and easy to understand, so that they can see that that positive return on investment is impacting all parties involved in the partnerships.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. I just want to thank the three of you again for your participation in this panel, and the Corporation for Skilled Workforce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Center for Education and Workforce, and the National Skills Coalition for your support of CTE and of this vision. We hope this episode has inspired you to take first steps to bring this vision to life. Visit Advanced CTE's website at the link below for resources to educate partners about the vision and begin first step towards implementation. Thank you for joining us.